I want to cover clinical trial regulation in India, and I think it's an important topic, um, obviously because it's covered a lot in the news today, and also because it's affecting all of us as we speak. And it would be good for all of us to understand what exactly it entails, what is the law behind what we are seeing, on a day-to-day basis, and accordingly better appreciate what exactly is happening on ground, both domestically as well as internationally. Because I mean, at the end of the day, as lawyers, it isn't enough for us to be accepting of what is being talked about, but we also need to dig deeper into understanding what exactly is happening behind the screens, right? So I think before we get into what's happening today um, in the COVID-19 era, it's also important to understand what clinical trial regulations have gone through over the past many years. And to that extent, the evolution provides a lot of context as to why India, especially, is very stringent in terms of clinical trial regulation. So, before I even get into this, I think maybe it's also important to understand what is a clinical trial, right? And what are the phases of the clinical trial? So, a clinical trial is basically a study conducted on human participants to test the safety and efficacy of a particular pharmaceutical product or a medical device product. When it comes to medical device products, we call it an investigation. And when it comes to pharmaceuticals, we typically call it a clinical trial. Even before you get to a position to be able to test your product on human participants, there are multiple stages that go behind it. And I'll cover that as we go through the deck. But in any case, to understand where we are today, I want to go, or at least split the clinical trial regulation into two buckets. The first bucket is what used to be the case pre 2013, and the other bucket is what happened post 2013. And the final bucket that we will examine as we go through this presentation is what's happening today. Now, pre 2013, we did have some amount of regulation with respect to how clinical trials need to be conducted in India, but these regulations were not very robust. And because of this, a lot of clinical trials that were being conducted in the country were largely unchecked in a manner that companies were able to conduct their trials in a largely unsupervised space. Now, all of this changed when a PIL was put out in the Supreme Court, and this was actually by one of a leading organizations called Swasthya Adhikar Manch, and they basically put out facts about how clinical trials are being conducted in the country, and they put out the question as to why it is happening the way that it is and what can we do to better regulate clinical trials in India. And that's when the Supreme Court made a very scathing observation with respect to clinical trial regulation in India. And they basically said that the Indian population were being used as guinea pigs for human trials for not only Indian pharmaceutical companies, but global pharmaceutical companies. So while many countries had stringent regulatory framework for clinical trials, because of the fact that India had a more relaxed regime, you would find that a lot of foreign companies would come to India, particularly for conducting the trial, and then decide not even to launch that product which was being trialed in India, but collect that data and take it back to the home country in order to use that data for the purposes of their submissions in the other country. And because of this, there were many areas that were highlighted as concerns, primarily where informed consent and compensation were to be looked into. So informed consent in a trial is very critical, because at the end of the day, you are testing a product which is currently still under development. While it is essential that you need to complete this phase, the subjects who are participating in that trial need to be fully aware of what they are getting into and the experimental nature of the trial itself. And for that, in most jurisdictions, you have what is called a informed consent. In an informed consent, you tell the subject that these are the possible risks involved. This is what the studies have found so far, and what could possibly go wrong with respect to the trial itself. Now, if something were to go wrong, again, in other jurisdictions, you have a very robust compensation framework, whereby if you do end up with what you refer to in a clinical trial as a serious adverse event, or an SAE, then there is a requirement under law to pay the subject a particular compensation, and that compensation is usually calculated on the basis of the current health of the subject before the trial was conducted, the age of the subject, and the capacity for that subject to earn, right? And all of these mechanisms were very well put out in many jurisdictions, but not in India. And that's when the Supreme Court in 2013 decided to very abruptly but rightly suspend clinical trials in India altogether, until the regulator were to come out with a more robust framework that would protect the interests of the clinical trial participants. So in 2013, you found that the Drug Controller General of India, who is the apex regulator for all things pharmaceuticals and medical devices, come out with a series of decisions in terms of how they would like to regulate clinical trials in India. And it was modeled largely around how other jurisdictions had also been conducting their trials. So it was only in 2013 that we received a more formalized structure with respect to covering aspects like informed consent as well as compensation mechanisms. And suddenly, any company that was looking to continue clinical trials in India had to actually comply with these requirements before it could be restarted. So it took a while, but once all of these mechanisms were put in place, the suspension of clinical trials was finally lifted, and accordingly, clinical trials were permitted to be conducted again. And this was what happened in 2013, and subsequently, as I mentioned, the DCGI had put out a series of orders that covered all of these aspects, but it had not yet been codified in the law. So it was only in 2019 where we received a brand new legislation in the form of the New Drugs and Clinical Trial Rules of 2019, that all of these various requirements, which were earlier captured in these orders, were put right into the law itself and nestled under the principal legislation, which is the Drugs and Cosmetics Act of 1940. So now there was a very formal and codified link between you wanting to conduct a particular trial and using that data for the purposes of approvals. Even the concept of how companies would come to India, collect the data, and then go away in order to produce that drug in another jurisdiction was taken care of during this period. And basically, there was an absolute restriction that was placed, whereby if a new chemical entity, which is the substance that is discovered to have some sort of therapeutic value to a person was not discovered in India, but was discovered in another jurisdiction, and you bring that new chemical entity into India for trial purposes, the only way you could do it is if you had already completed some amount of clinical trials in the jurisdiction from where you are bringing it from. So in that way, you ensured that these products were not going to be tested for the first time on an Indian population just because it may be more stringent in another population to test. In addition, there was also an undertaking that now needed to be submitted, which basically said that if you are going to do a clinical trial in India, you must compulsorily launch that product in India as well. So through that mechanism, you ensured that those companies that wanted to conduct trials in India had some ultimate benefit to the Indian population by making sure that any trial conducted would eventually see the launch of a pharmaceutical product in India as well. And that's how the evolution of clinical trials have taken place in the country. So to get into what exactly are the rules governing clinical trials in India, first of all, as I mentioned, you have the principal legislation, which is the Drugs and Cosmetics Act of 1940. And this law, it governs the manufacture, distribution, sale, import, and export of all pharmaceutical and biopharmaceutical and medical device products in the country. So in order for you to reach a stage where you can sell a product in India, which is pharmaceutical or medical device in nature, you need to undergo the process of proving its safety and efficacy. And that's where the clinical trial regulations kick in. Now, within the Drugs and Cosmetics Act of 1940, there are two rules that are of relevance. One is the Drugs and Cosmetics Rules of 1945, which contained a chapter dedicated to how clinical trials needed to be conducted. And for the longest time, that's how we had regulations for clinical trials. And then in 2019, the clinical trial rules came out, and that became a dedicated set of rules which talked about how exactly clinical trials needed to be conducted. So largely, this is the legal framework within which the clinical trials are regulated. But apart from that, there are other bodies that are closely linked to how clinical trials need to be conducted here. One, of course, is the ICMR, or the Indian Council of Medical Research. And the Indian Council of Medical Research also has a guideline, the last version of which was released in 2017, which basically codifies again what kind of ethical practices need to be complied with while conducting a clinical trial. So we have what is referred to as the ethical guidelines for biomedical research in human participants. And these guidelines capture how exactly the trial needs to be conducted. Now, these ICMR guidelines have been made legally mandatory by way of reference into the law itself. So because of the fact that the clinical trial rules and earlier the drugs and cosmetics rules made a reference that all companies wishing to participate in clinical trials need to comply with the ICMR guidelines. Accordingly, these rules had legal force, and they continue to have legal force today as well. But apart from that, there is also one additional body, which is what we refer to as the Indian, or not even the Institutional Ethics Committee, or the Independent Ethics Committee, depending on the nature of the committee itself. The Ethics Committee is one of the primary overseers of the clinical trial. They are constituted either at the institutional level or they are constituted independently, and accordingly, the reference to the Ethics Committee varies. And they have a constitution of an independent body of a multitude of different kind of individuals. For example, there are 7 to 8 mandatory qualifications required in order for you to be part of that particular ethics committee, you need to have one lawyer, you need to have one medical expert, you need to have one patient organization member, and accordingly, you have a variety of people who form the basis for this ethics committee. And this ethics committee oversees the entire conduct of the clinical trial, and every step of the clinical trial is actually approved before it takes place through the ethics committee. Then you have the overseeing authority on top of the ethics committee, which is the Central Drug Standard Control Organization, for which the head is the DCGI. And accordingly, this is the framework within which the clinical trial regulations take place. So what is the general process for conducting a clinical trial? As I said, there are multiple phases of a clinical trial, and it doesn't start with the trial itself. So the first step of any research for a pharmaceutical is in the drug discovery phase. And that drug discovery phase is where scientists as well as clinicians sit together and they go through thousands and thousands of different chemicals in order to determine if any of these particular chemicals have a therapeutic effect on the human body. And all of this is conducted in a laboratory setting. And once a particular a chemical is identified as therapeutic in nature, we move to what we refer to as the clinical development phase. And in the clinical development phase, we again, in a laboratory setting, try and figure out, based on past literature, based on the standards for chemistry, as to whether that particular identified chemical is generally regarded to be safe for use in a human participant. And only if that safety study is conducted and that safety study looks to be promising, will you move to phase 1 of a clinical trial. Phase 1 of a clinical trial is primarily a safety study again, but this is outside of a clinical laboratory setting, and you actually have a very small number of human participants who are administered the study drug. And when you and in the small population, you check and verify that the safety data that you have generated earlier correlate with the safety data that you are now seeing in the actual administration of that product in human participants. If it is now conclusively determined that in that phase 1 trial, the product is found to be safe, you move to phase 2. And usually in a phase 1 trial, you have a maximum of around 100 participants or so. And that's after which you move to phase 2, which you increase the study population by a certain amount. Usually you look at around 200 to 250 participants. And in these participants, you conduct efficacy studies. So you again have to correlate whether the therapeutic value that you have discovered actually translates into the population to whom you are administering that particular product. So in this phase, the trial can be conducted in many different ways. One very popular way is called a double-blinded study. And in a double-blinded study, what takes place is that you have one set of a population which is administered the study drug, and then you have another set of population which is provided with a placebo. And when you talk about what a placebo is, it is basically the product without the actual therapeutic chemical, which is administered in a particular set of individuals without their knowledge that it has no therapeutic value. So in simple terms, it's basically a sugar pill. And so what you do is that in the group that receives the placebo, they act as the control for that entire study, because when you have to test the efficacy, you have to test the efficacy as a measure of the baseline, and that baseline being somebody who has not received that particular product. So in that way, you're able to compare people who have received the product and people who have not received the product, whether there's actually any difference between the two populations. And accordingly, that trial is conducted in order to determine whether the efficacy is actually what was determined at the laboratory phase. Once the efficacy is determined, we move on to phase 3. And phase 3 is where you have a larger population. And in this larger population, you have a variety of people. You have people who, and again, all of this depends on the base document for any clinical trial, which is called a clinical trial protocol. And that protocol will determine how exactly the entire trial is going to be conducted, from what kind of subjects you want to recruit to the number of subjects that you will plan to recruit, who the study drug will be administered to, etc., etc. And depending on the clinical trial protocol, in the phase 3, what you would do is that you would start testing it amongst a larger variety of individuals. For example, if your clinical trial protocol is also trying to target breastfeeding women or lactating women, women of a particular age, men of a particular age, then in that case, that larger variety of people are taken in phase 3 to again ensure that the safety and efficacy of that product is okay in a diverse set of population. Once phase 3 is completed, you have a phase 4. And a phase 4 is actually a post-approval marketing surveillance, or a PMS study. Now, phase 4 actually takes place after the regulator provides their approval for the company to launch their product, but the company is required to continue to study the serious adverse events with respect to that product for a period of a couple of years, even after the approval. So every time there is a problem with that product, it is compulsorily required to be reported back to the regulator. And accordingly, the regulator can take a call as to whether that particular approval needs to be modified, if any further warnings need to be placed on the package, or if it can continue as is. So there is a constant monitoring mechanism which takes place for a period of almost 2 years after the product gets into the market, in order for you to ensure that that product is safe and continues to be safe in a particular population. So another question that comes up very frequently even now is if a drug is approved outside of India, can it be marketed in India without conducting a clinical trial? And for this, we have to understand why this is even a question. The reason is we have a diverse population with different genetic makeup across the world. So if you were to compare an Asian population with a Caucasian population, or with a African population, or any population for that matter, every race of individual comes with it certain unique genetic makeup, which does not necessarily mean that if a drug were to be tested on one particular kind of individuals, it would have the same effect on another set of individuals. So the clinical trial regulations even account for this. And therefore, even if a product is approved in another jurisdiction, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are able to market your product in India without conducting a local clinical trial. A local clinical trial needs to be conducted to ensure that the product, even though is approved on another population, it continues to be safe and efficacious from an Indian standpoint as well. So depending on the kind of approval that is received for that particular product, which is very dependent on the amount of data that you are able to submit to the Indian regulator, there is an option given to the regulator to either conduct the trial, let's say from phase 2 onwards, or even phase 3 onwards. So effectively, the clinical trial regulations does contain certain relaxations or waivers from having to conduct particular trials in the local area. And but usually in a general setting, it is almost impossible for a company to be able to market a product in India without having conducted that local trial to some extent at least. And we call this a bridging study. The bridging study is basically showing that the same efficacy and safety that was detected in the other population in another jurisdiction continues to hold good even in India and the Indian population. So that's a lot of what we are hearing today in terms of whether local clinical trial is required or not for the COVID-19 vaccinations. Now, at the same time, the regulator is also granted with certain extraordinary powers, and that is specifically to be used in a public health emergency, such as a pandemic. Now, in these scenarios, it is possible for the regulator to waive even the local clinical trial requirement. And if that product is approved in certain developed jurisdictions, for example, the US FDA has approved a product, the MHRA, which is the UK approval, the UK regulator, the Japanese regulator, the World Health Organization, or even the Australian regulator, then in that case, the regulator in India on a case-to-case basis is able to grant certain waivers with respect to the trial needed to be conducted in India, primarily because the product has been tested to be safe and efficacious in another approved jurisdiction, and the regulator is confident about the regulatory practices of these other jurisdictions, and therefore they're able to rely on that particular data in order to release it on an immediate basis to treat a public health emergency. And we'll circle back to this concept as we go through how exactly things have happened in the COVID-19 situation. So, if a lot of you have been following the news with respect to Covaxin and Covishield and what exactly this emergency use authorization is, this is where things have changed with respect to the entire clinical trial framework, right? And this is where, again, it's important to understand what relaxations are permitted by the regulator and what relaxations are not, right? So, Covishield, which is the AstraZeneca and the University of Oxford developed COVID-19 vaccine, as well as Covaxin, which is the ICMR and Bharat Biotech developed COVID-19 vaccine, were both one of the initial contenders for the development of COVID-19 vaccinations. And the entire process for that trial took place at the outset of the pandemic itself. So at that time, there were not a lot of other vaccines available, and there was almost no data to support the safety and efficacy of these particular products, because we had just gotten into the pandemic, and these were one of the first couple of products that were being released into the market. Now, because of that, the regulator required both Bharat Biotech as well as the Serum Institute, which was licensed out the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine, to conduct almost a full-scale clinical trial before they were permitted to launch into the Indian market. Again, you have to remember the reason for this is because these trials were conducted almost exclusively in India, and they were being tested for the first time on any population in India. So there needed to be a complete clinical trial in order to be able to evaluate the safety and efficacy of these products. So both Serum Institute and Bharat Biotech undertook the exercise of going right from phase 1 onwards and completing the entire exercise of the entire study. Covishield, at least, that was the case. But when it came to Covaxin, the approval was granted prior to the release of the phase 3 clinical trial data, which, if all of you have been reading the news, would also show why there was so much hesitation and also a lot of media scrutiny with respect to how the approval had been granted without the completion of the phase 3 clinical trial or the submission of the phase 3 clinical trial data. There was also a lot of media scrutiny with respect to how the informed consent process was taking place and whether compensation was being provided adequately in case of a serious adverse event, and whether these adverse events were being reported to the regulator during the entire trial process. So, when it came to Covishield, you saw that the entire process had been completed in the regular manner. But um, if you take a look at how vaccines are generally approved in a regular scenario, um, you would find that typically it takes many years before you finish the entire clinical trial phase and you are able to launch a product into the market, because the development phase itself will take years, the trial phase will take another couple of years, and then only are you able to make a submission for launch of your product in India. However, all of these phases were expedited in a particular manner. And the reason for the expedition is also because of the relaxations provided within the clinical trial framework to deal with the public health emergency. Because if we were to go through the regular route in order to obtain approvals for these vaccines, we would not be seeing a vaccine in the next 5 years, because that is typically how long it takes for you to be able to conduct a full scale clinical trial as well as approval process. Which is why not only in India, but in other jurisdictions, regulators had taken the approach of granting what we refer to as an emergency use authorization or an EUA. Now, why while it is referred to as an EUA even in India, it is not a recognized legal concept within the clinical trial framework. However, the outcome of what is an expedited approval process is basically the same as what you would refer to as an emergency use authorization, which is used in other jurisdictions such as the US. Now, like I said, because of the entire expeditious manner in which we conducted these trials, the regulator only granted an EUA because they went under the process for public health emergencies, and the approval granted for these vaccines are limited to only dealing with the public health emergency. So effectively, what that means is that once the pandemic is subsided, the approval will go away automatically, because the approval is only provided for the purposes of this particular pandemic. And if you want to continue to market this product even after the pandemic subsides, then you need to approach the regulator for a full-fledged clinical trial approval as well as a marketing authorization. So, and this is the practice that's been followed in all jurisdictions, whereby the regulators are granting emergency use authorizations. These emergency use authorizations are limited for the period of the pandemic. And once the pandemic subsides, you will find that these authorizations, unless supplemented by further data and trials, will automatically cease to exist. So that's where we are today with respect to Covaxin and Covishield. And the reason behind why so much of expedition had taken place, I explained to you. And at the same time, it is permitted within the legal framework for the regulator to do so because of the special provisions that are granted when it comes to a public health emergency, such as the one that we are in currently. So because of all of these factors, you found that Covishield and Covaxin were being put out into the market a lot sooner than would otherwise be the time frame for a regular vaccine to be released into the market. But what has changed since then? And that's an important question. And that gets into the current situation that we are dealing with. So if you look at the scenario today, you have Pfizer, you have Moderna, you have Sinopharm, and you have Sputnik, and you have other companies who are also developing their own vaccinations. The Pfizer product has been approved in multiple jurisdictions. The Moderna vaccine has been approved in multiple jurisdictions. So has Sputnik. So has Sinopharm. Now, all of these vaccines have also made it into a list that is published by the World Health Organization, referred to as the emergency use listing. So the World Health Organization at a global level has also analyzed and studied the data coming from various countries for the vaccines that are being approved in different jurisdictions. And on the basis of what they believe has become a safe and efficacious product, they are listing it onto the emergency use listing. Now, we are almost, in fact, we're quite a while into the pandemic, closing in on 2.5 years. And that being the case, a lot of data has been generated with respect to the various vaccines that were developed somewhere in the last year, right? And now multiple jurisdictions have also issued their stamp of approval or their authorizations to have that particular vaccine marketed in their jurisdiction. India, for the longest time, had recommended that even though these vaccines were given approvals in other jurisdictions, they still needed to conduct the bridging study for the reasons that I had mentioned, which is that we don't know whether they work well on an Indian population. However, once the second wave set in and we saw that the need for vaccination was all the more paramount in order to try and curb this spread as much as possible, the regulator started relaxing some of these requirements, also because there was more data now to analyze from other jurisdictions in terms of the safety and efficacy. So as time goes by, you find that the populations outside of India also include Indian population who may have migrated into other jurisdictions, and therefore those people who are part of these trials technically would mean that even though we have not conducted an India specific trial, enough number of people across the world have now received the vaccine, and the safety and efficacy data coming out of those vaccinations proving to be promising, have led to the situation where the regulator has now waived a local clinical trial requirement altogether. And this happened actually in this week itself. So what the regulator is now saying is that if you have a vaccine that is developed in another jurisdiction and has been approved by either the US FDA, the MHRA, the WHO, or the Japanese medical regulator, then in that case, you can approach the Indian regulator with that data, and you are able to get an emergency use authorization on the basis of that data in a period of almost 3 days, right? So the regulator has really stepped up with respect to trying to ensure that vaccine availability can be rolled out as quick as possible. And they have come down on the timeline significantly, especially for products that have already received their approval and for which the data is now significantly generated in other populations. So you find in today's scenario, a company is able to make their application giving the data that is generated in other jurisdictions. They receive an emergency use authorization, and then they are permitted to import the product into India. However, after you import the product into India, you are first required to only vaccinate 100 beneficiaries. And this safety data coming out of these 100 beneficiaries need to be submitted to the regulator. And the regulator, along with the subject expert committee or the technical experts that will look into these submissions, will, in a period of 7 days, be able to verify that these foreign vaccines are safe on the Indian population. And on that basis, they will be given the permission to roll out the vaccination on a nationwide process, right? So, in all of this, you have now waived off the local clinical trial requirement, but at the same time, you have maintained a certain check and balance to ensure that the safety is still holding good when it comes to the Indian population. In addition, the batches of vaccine that come into India from these foreign manufacturers are also required to be tested by the Central Drugs Laboratory, or the CDL, in Kasauli. And the Central Drugs Laboratory is basically the apex lab in India that undertakes all testing of all various drugs and medical devices in India. So every batch, meaning if there is one consignment which was manufactured in one batch that comes into India, each batch needs to be tested by the regulator before it can be used for the purpose of the larger rollout. So in that way, you ensure, and now what the regulator has also done in terms of trying to reduce that timeline is that they have said that instead of a batch testing, you can get the batch tested with your home jurisdiction's laboratory, and you have to submit the data that has come out of that testing to the Indian laboratory for their verification. So a very important document that is not only relevant from a COVID-19 point of view, but generally, is called a certificate of analysis, or the COA. The certificate of analysis will prescribe what kind of testing was conducted on that particular product and whether it met the parameters for safety and efficacy for that particular batch. So now, in the current scenario, the government has allowed for foreign vaccines to come into India, but every batch needs to have their COA submitted to the central laboratory for their verification and release. And every time the central laboratory releases a particular batch, that batch can be used for the purpose of a vaccine rollout in India. And that's how we are seeing the entire process of the vaccination that's taking place today. So all of this is well and good, but do we see any issues today with respect to how clinical trial, rules have come out, and whether there needs to be any kind of reforms? So one of the primary takeaways from the entire pandemic is also the fact that sometimes there may be enough data that has been generated in other jurisdictions to justify a, a waived trial or a expedited trial in India. And right now, unless it is a public health emergency, there is almost no way in which a company can seek an expedited approval or a waiver for a local clinical trial in India. However, we think that it has come to a stage, especially when the drug regulator in India is well aware of the approval processes of certain other jurisdictions, whereby even those jurisdictions have a very stringent policy for clinical trial approvals as well as data study. Maybe it has come to a period where you can rely on the data submitted by or to other regulators in developed jurisdictions, and on that basis release products in India as well. The reason we say this is because outside of a pandemic, there are many products that are available in other jurisdictions which never make its way into India. One issue, of course, is on the IP side, whereby our patent framework is not so robust in order to protect some of these innovative molecules. But the other side is also because of the way in which the clinical trial regulations work. Because in many developed jurisdictions, it is acceptable for a trial to be conducted in another jurisdiction and not to be conducted locally. But that's not the case in India. And because of this additional requirement, which incurs additional cost and incurs additional liability, a lot of companies shy away from releasing products into India. And effectively, the Indian population ends up losing out on some very innovative products which are available in other jurisdictions. So it may be time for us to revisit whether the waivers and the relaxations that are provided for approved products in other jurisdictions can actually be used even outside of a public health emergency. And maybe this could be a stopgap measure because as of today, India is a very generic focused pharmaceutical market, which means that most companies that are developing products in India are doing it on the backs of companies that have already discovered and put out their own version of those products. So there is not a lot of innovation that is taking place in the Indian market, because of which we rely very heavily on foreign companies to discover new therapeutic products and accordingly bring them into India. So and to give you some context, there are almost a maximum of 2 to 3 products that have been discovered in India of therapeutic value in the entire history of clinical trial regulation. So, and you know the number of kind of products that we have in the market, all of which have been discovered by foreign companies through their entire trial procedures, etc. So we rely very heavily on other companies in other jurisdictions for their research and development process itself. Not only because it's a very time-consuming process, but it requires a great amount of expertise and it requires a huge amount of capital. Usually, a clinical trial will cost you anywhere, um, to the tune of almost $1 billion in order to complete the entire trial process. And that's not something that a lot of companies can foot today in India, especially because out of, let's say, 10 clinical trials that are conducted, all of which cost the same amount, there may only be one out of those 10 clinical trials which actually result in a promising drug being released into the market. So the cost and the opportunity cost is very, very large when it comes to getting into the drug development phase. So until the Indian industry is able to manage to discover their own therapeutic products, and while we continue to rely very heavily on foreign companies to provide their innovative products, there is a requirement to try and ease out some of the regulatory restrictions in a manner so that you are able to incentivize these companies from releasing more innovative therapeutic areas to the Indian population. Because at the end of the day, it is the Indian population that will ultimately benefit from having these innovative molecules in the Indian market as well.
There are instances of participants being paid to participate in clinical trials. And then there are cases that have taken place in countries like ours, where clinical trials are conducted on people from socioeconomic backgrounds where they do not have the understanding or the wherewithal to really follow what's going on, and these trials are conducted on them. Do our laws or our regulatory framework has anything to say about the instances in which clinical trials must be conducted on subjects?
That's a great question. Thank you. The short answer is yes, but I'll get into that. And I know this is coming also from some of the media scrutiny that's taken place with the current approval process today. First of all, let's remember that compensation or a payment to a subject is not completely restricted. You are permitted to pay a clinical trial subject, but not in a manner that will incentivize that subject to participate in the trial. You are allowed to reimburse, let's say, the day's expenses or the commute to the hospital or the clinic where the study drug is being administered, and that is permitted. So if you look into some of the media scrutiny that took place for one of the vaccines today, the payments that were being made were actually for days' wages that would otherwise have been lost if the person had been participating in the trial. And that is actually not to be looked at in the same lens as an incentive to participate. An incentive to participate would be if you were to provide over and above what the person would otherwise be losing if they took place in that particular trial. So, and again, the socioeconomic background of the trial subject is also required to be looked into, because in an urban population, payment of, let's say, rupees 3,000 would not be considered an incentive. But then you take the same rupees 3,000 and you go to a rural area, that may be considered an incentive. So the check that the regulations have is that you have an ethics committee. That ethics committee looks into the clinical trial protocol. The clinical trial protocol needs to specify what kind of benefits or compensation the participant will receive for the particular participation. And they will have to determine whether that participation, the payment for that participation will cross the line from reimbursement or just putting that person back into a good stead into an incentive for participation itself. So that's on the compensation. And I would say that what's taken place in the rural areas, as far as I know, has been to only provide days' wages for the purposes of what would otherwise have been lost. And I don't think that they had crossed into the arena of incentive in order to provide the, in order to have the subject recruited for the purpose of the study. The other aspect is in terms of literacy and whether the person is aware of what they are getting into when it comes to the vaccination process. This is also very well captured in the law, not only generally with respect to all populations, but specifically with vulnerable populations as well. So to give you an understanding, for all subjects, the informed consent form has very strict requirements as to what needs to be disclosed at the time of getting a subject to get recruited. At the same time, informed consent form also requires that if the person to whom you are approaching for recruitment is not literate or is unable to comprehend or read, that not only needs to be explained to the person in a vernacular language, but that person has to then have a witness certify that this entire consent form was explained to that person. And after it was explained in that vernacular language, that person still decided to agree to participate in the trial. For vulnerable populations, the rules go one step ahead, and this entire consent process needs to be recorded and maintained by the conductors of the clinical trial. And that record is maintained by the ethics committee for a period of almost 5 years post that trial. In the event anybody raises a concern that if there was an issue with respect to obtaining that trial consent, that recording is there for purposes of evidence itself. So overall, the framework has dealt with that situation very well. The implementation is overseen by the ethics committee and then by the regulator, and the scrutiny is accordingly put in place for these purposes.
Yes, thank you very much.
This is in context with the current vaccine trials going on the children for the. So what are the legal implications here? Because consent being a very major component of trials, here we are doing trials on minors, and that's where the minors' consent is not a consent, informed consent. Can you put some light on that?
Yeah. Good question again. And the rules for clinical trials in minor participants are also well captured. In a trial which has minors, the consent process is done only in the presence of what is referred to in the law as a legally acceptable representative. And that person is someone who is, authorized by law to stand in the entire process to agree to whether the informed consent is appropriate or not. So what I'm also saying is that when a child is asked to participate in a trial, the legally acceptable representative, who may be a parent or any other person authorized by law, for example, a guardian, is also required to be present during the informed consent process. And that guardian or parent is required to sign the form after having explained the entire process to the child. And the parent or the guardian has to also be comfortable in terms of their child or ward participating in the trial as well. So the requirement under law is that you need to ensure that the legally authorized representative has understood the entire process, has understood the entire risk involved, and has passed on that information to the child as well. And accordingly, the ethics committee takes a look at each and every consent that has been granted to scrutinize as to whether that process was conducted in a proper manner.
Thank you so much.
I see a question in the chat box. Yeah, this is again a good question, and I should have covered it before. So there are two aspects to compensation. One is medical management, and the other is with respect to compensation in the event of an adverse reaction. So when there is an adverse reaction, the law requires for the sponsor of the study, which is basically the company, to provide medical management for free, regardless of whether the adverse event took place because of the study drug or not. Until such time, the ethics committee and the regulator determines whether that adverse reaction took place because of the study drug itself. So what does that mean? It means that during the time where you are enrolled as a clinical trial subject and you meet with an accident, for example, or you have a heart attack that's not even related to the trial in any way, the sponsor is still required to manage your medical expenses up until the time it is determined whether or not that particular event took place because of the study drug. If it is determined that the study drug had nothing to do with the adverse event, only from that period on will there not be a requirement for the sponsor to not do the medical management, but they cannot recover the cost of medical management up until that point. So you have that part covered completely. The other aspect is the compensation overall with respect to an injury or a death that takes place. In both situations, where it is conclusively determined by the regulator that the injury or death has taken place because of a study drug itself, the compensation that can be paid can go almost up to around 80 lakhs for a particular trial subject. And it keeps going down depending on the risk factor, the age, and the capacity to earn. So in a trial subject who is possibly 16 years of age, who has no comorbidities, and is absolutely healthy at the time of entering into the trial, if that person were to die as part because of the study drug, then you get the maximum compensation payable. But at the same time, if you are a 60-year-old who has multiple comorbidities, and it is determined that the study drug has caused the death or injury, then the payout for that particular individual is lower in comparison, because accordingly the risk factors are calculated and there is a mechanism to be followed within the law for that purpose. Thank you.